I have never read a poem by Dr. David M. Lampton. I've read some Li Jiaoxing poems, but I've never read a poem by my old and very close friend, Mike Lampton. I have, however, read his books, as I'm sure many of you have. And as you know, if you have read Professor Lampton's books over a long career in the study of China and U.S.-China relations, he is probably certainly among the 2 or 3 most judicious and best informed analysts of contemporary China for Western readers that the United States has produced. It is no accident that in a recent ranking of American China specialists that was done in China, we're also obsessed with ranks these days, ranks of colleges, ranks of consulting firms, ranks of everything, that Mike Lampton ranked number 1 among the long list of distinguished Americans who have been studying China for their whole careers. And I was therefore very happy when I invited Mike, we all called Dr. Lampton Mike, to speak as the American keynoter this morning. I was very happy that he agreed to do so. He has important perspectives that will complement and further develop the ideas that are opening our meeting today. Please welcome Professor David M. Lampton of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University.
Well, good morning. It's good to be here at the Carter Center and be greeted with an alum from SAIS, among other things. So thank you for welcoming us all, Ambassador Peters. And please give our respects to President and Mrs. Carter. They have a special place in our heart. I do want to thank the Carter Center and the Shanghai Academy and the World Forum for convening this important meeting. And I do want to say I took on board your message about Ambassador Peters about waging peace. I think that's a very salient task that stands before us right now. I'm also glad to be on the podium and be honored to share the microphone with former Foreign Minister Li Jiaoxing. And I think as you were speaking, you gave us some nutrition for the mind, I think is how you put it. Finally, my old friend, Professor Huang Renwei, I just remember meeting him decades ago. We both had the privilege of working and knowing Mayor, I'll always call him Mayor Wang Daohan. And that Shanghai has done so much as a city for U.S.-China relationship. It's really played a global role and a certainly big role in bilateral relationships. I also thought it was very wise what Huang Renwei said about Atlanta and the importance of localities in our relationship. Essentially, by implication, we're often talking about state-to-state, national, Washington-Beijing relations. But this is a relationship between 2 societies. We're deeply interpenetrated at a multiple levels, and I'm struck as I get around the country and speak to people how much more productive and mutually beneficial the relationship often is at local levels than at the national level. In a sense, our 2 capitals are boxing rings in which we slug it out on the big controversial issues. But what makes this relationships, I think, durable and really gratifying is the relationship between all of the localities and institutions. 1 out of every 3 foreign students in this country is Chinese. Most of us, at least that are professors, encounter Chinese people every day at really the deepest levels of thought and interaction. So I'm going to concentrate, contrary to what I might have just led you to expect, on the national level. And I think we are at a troubled time in our relationship. And I think people who want to make it better have to talk about what the troubles are, just as a doctor has to diagnose the disease. And then we can proceed in a constructive direction. So my purpose here isn't to anger or depress, it's to give us an implicit roadmap about what needs to be fixed. I'm an optimist. This is probably not the most optimistic set of remarks I've given. Now, here at the Carter Center, 37 years after the event, it's fitting that we recall the vision and courage and leadership demonstrated by President Carter and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping when they normalized relations. They undertook enormous risks at the time, both in their domestic societies and in their relationship between our two countries. This was a high-risk decision. Today, soon after May 4th, and in the 70th year of the commemoration of the victory over Japan, as Ambassador Lee pointed out, the question is really whether America and China can again summon the vision in today's far different circumstances that President Carter and Deng Xiaoping summoned 37 years ago. So my purpose here is to really look at what are the problems, but I do want to end in the spirit that Ambassador Lee talked about, and that is we must amplify what we agree about and what is in our common interest, and not and try to, the best we can, downplay the problems. But I am going to here talk primarily about the problems. For 8 U.S. and 5 administrations, Washington and Beijing maintained remarkable policy continuity. Broadly speaking, we could call it constructive engagement. This continuity has persisted despite periodic instabilities, problems, and crises. And some of these left a lot of scar tissue along the way. We've come along a bumpy road, but I think we've maintained remarkable policy continuity. None of these challenges ever destroyed our overall assessments in both of our nations that we each had a fundamental shared interest in cooperation and that the costs of conflict would always outweigh the possible gains. Assessments of relative power in both of our countries for much of the last 4 decades has created few incentives in either society to rethink our fundamental policy. Chinese were seemingly resigned to live with the hegemon, as one Chinese professor put it, and Americans were secure in their dominance and preoccupied with conflicts elsewhere. After the 9/11 attacks, China was seen as non-threatening and indeed willing to use some of its resources in the war against terror. In a reflective moment after the 9/11 attacks at a speech at SAIS, our then Ambassador Sandy Rant told the students, he said, you know, we've seen the enemy, and it's not China. That struck me as a very good formulation. In the economic realm, expectations for growth in each of our societies created common interests that subordinated many of the underlying frictions, whether economic or human rights. This positive balance between hope and fear tripped behavior towards restraint and patience. Things, unfortunately, have changed dramatically since about 2010. The tipping point is near. Our respective fears are nearer to outweighing our hopes than at any time since normalization. We're witnessing the erosion of some of the critical underlying supports for predominantly positive U.S.-China ties. Though the foundation has not crumbled, today important components of the American policy elite increasingly are coming to see China as a threat to the primacy of the United States. In China, increasing factions of the elite and public see America as an impediment to China's achieving its rightful international role, and that we are not helpful to their maintenance of domestic stability. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd put it well, characterizing the narrative of an unidentified Chinese Communist Party document. I believe it was probably the new National Security Blue Book, and analogous American thinking in the following terms, quote, in Beijing's eyes, the U.S. is deeply opposed to China's rise. American strategy towards China, it said, had 5 objectives: to isolate the country, contain it, diminish it, divide it, and sabotage its leadership. The American narrative, as Rudd described it, is hardly more positive. He said, quote, Beijing's long-term policy is aimed at pushing the United States out of Asia all together and establishing a Chinese sphere of influence spanning the region. Since about 2008, there has been a sequence of regional and global developments and incidents that have provided fertile soil in which these negative narratives have grown in each of our societies. Among them are the 2008 financial crisis, incidents in Hong Kong, developments in the East and South China Seas, U.S. inability to quickly exit Middle Eastern and Central Asian quagmires, and the confusion in America and elsewhere about where China is headed internally and in terms of its foreign policy. Current Chinese debate over Western universal values, subversions, black hands, unsettles most outsiders, and certainly not least Americans. So, what's happening? If developments continue along the current trajectory, both countries will have progressively less security at higher cost. The probabilities of intentional or accidental confrontations will increase. The world will enjoy less cooperation on transnational issues requiring joint Sino-American efforts. And economic welfare in both of our societies will be diminished. What can we do? Fundamentally, America has to rethink its objective of primacy. And China must recalibrate its own sense of strength and what that strength entitles it to. Americans must find ways to accommodate China's rightful desire for greater voice in international affairs, in institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, in the International Monetary Fund. And China should improve relations with its neighbors, reassure them. The words accommodation and compromise in either China or the United States aren't dirty words. Both nations must be more realistic about their own power, what constitutes power, and how it can be exercised in a world in which the central reality is interdependence. Sino-American interdependence needs to be systematically reinforced, and joint security and economic institutions must be created. Balance and stability in Asia should be our common objective, not the primacy of either side. Now, to inject some balance into this somber portrait, there have been some very significant and positive recent developments in U.S.-China relations and Chinese foreign policy, not least President Xi Jinping's oft expressed desires to avoid conflict, emphasize cooperation, and pursue mutually beneficial outcomes, the new type major power relationship that has been much discussed in the world. Other developments of a positive nature include agreement to pursue a bilateral investment treaty, some progress on Sino-Japanese and Sino-Vietnamese relations, progress in the climate change area, somewhat improved military-to-military exchanges, and the recent and upcoming summits between President Xi and Obama. Economic and investment relations are growing briskly, and in U.S.-China student exchanges, as I said, we are awash and in a welcome tsunami of Chinese students, and more Americans are going to China. Nonetheless, our two countries also have headed in some undesirable directions in some of their remarks and some of their actions. President Obama's February 18th instructions to White House staff disseminated publicly, quote, "That is why we have to make sure the United States and not countries like China is the one writing the century's rules for the world economy." Such remarks, later alternately softened and hardened, are unrealistic and unproductive and counterproductive, alienating the United States not only from those already suspicious of America, but also from our allies. This attitude contributed to the U.S. decision to resist the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the eventual outcome in which 57 nations, many American friends and allies, agreed to become charter members of the AAIB despite initial U.S. preferences. For an unnamed U.S. official to criticize publicly Britain's constant accommodation of China, saying this is not the way to engage a rising power, this erodes influence with friends and competitors alike. Similarly, China's leaders has set off alarm bells by saying, quote, let people of Asia run the affairs of Asia, solve the problems of Asia, uphold the security of Asia, end quote. Earlier remarks in 2010 by another senior official set off a warning when saying, quote, China's a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. These remarks, whether made by Washington or Beijing, are not helpful. While Beijing and Washington now are using the rhetoric of, quote, competitors, end quote, in polite discussion, increasingly, strategic thinkers in both nations are acting on the assumption that we are adversaries in the security realm. If one believes, as I do, that in the final analysis, perceived security threats trump economic and cultural interests, this suggests that admittedly enormous shared economic and cultural interests may not prevail over diverging security concerns. There's more than one way for a nation to contribute to the security anxieties of others. One is to identify perceived challenges to your security and then propose muscular ways to respond. Such voices are gaining strength in the United States, though they are not yet dominating policy. These views suggest the following. The past decades of engagement efforts with the PRC have created a national security challenge for Washington, not a cooperative partner. That America needs a new grand strategy relating to China that maintains U.S. primacy, that tighter export controls and more allied unity are needed with respect to China, that more defense spending and hardware deployments to the region are needed, along with further allied cooperation on missile defense, and that responses that impose costs on Beijing for cyber intrusions are required. Another way to be provocative, in this case China, is to assert that America is decreasingly able to act in Asia, that the Pax Americana in the region is dead, that the United States is unshackling Japan to ride roughshod over the region and to ignore the security benefits of the U.S.-Japan alliance and instead focus on its allegedly destabilizing character. Most worrisome, many thinking Americans believe that Beijing is implementing a strategy to incrementally and unilaterally change the status quo in the East and South China Seas, with the construction of new and expanded islands being just the most recent manifestation. The trend in domestic discourse in both China and the United States over the last 15 years has been from emphasizing a vocabulary of hedging and from a heavy hedge or a light hedge to a heavy hedge. Increasingly, the vocabulary is heading towards a deterrence vocabulary. Deterrence vocabulary leads to discussions of threat, of will, capability, second strike, and credibility, much like we had as a discussion with the Soviet Union. This is a far different vocabulary than the one that generally was employed during the last 40 years. What worries me is the gradual migration of the center of gravity of elite and popular discussion in both nations towards more extreme analyses and policy recommendations that simply feed one on the other. Past policy isn't collapsed, but it is weakening. Now let me just move through this to what I think are some constructive kinds of suggestions that I might want to make here. So what's to be done? Let's start by articulating two principles. First, the distribution of relative power internationally has shifted, with the rise of the emerging markets, a prominent one being China. What seemed the natural order of the post-World War II period, when the U.S. accounted for around 35% of global GDP, is not sustainable when the United States is below 20%. This development does not mean that Americans will have lower absolute welfare or less power, but it does mean that the institutions and patterns of behavior premised on overwhelming American primacy need to be adjusted to take account of the rise of others. Accommodating their legitimate aspirations for voice in the international system is not weakness, it's not appeasement, it's essential to a stable international order to maintain American influence. Resisting new institutions and redistributed influence will increasingly leave the United States isolated and drained. An informed and broad-based debate among the media, government officials, intellectuals, and the public is desperately needed here in the United States. Second, if China continues to create anxiety among neighboring states, to attack Western values, raise the specter of foreign subversion, it will incentivize others to acquire increasing coercive capacity themselves and to seek the protective embrace of more distant powers, not least the United States. Anything that resembles a call for spheres of influence where regional big powers are conceded disproportionate influence is not a formula for stability or acceptance in an interdependent world. The single biggest thing China could do is to improve relations with its key neighbors and to take some of these maritime disputes off the table. In an earlier era, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai did this with Vietnam. Subsequently, Deng Xiaoping did this with Japan. More specifically, what might the United States do? First, we need to begin an admittedly long process by which our two countries, along with others, can create inclusive economic and security institutions regionally and adapt post-World War II global and regional institutions to the new distribution of power in the world. And in the Asia-Pacific, the IMF voting share issue should be low-hanging fruit. While this all will take time, absent this, the US and China and others will unilaterally augment their own security, construct parallel economic and security institutions, and we will see the United States and China drift into progressively more adversarial positions. Beijing and Washington need something like a fourth communique, laying out such a vision. We don't need 50 points. We do need 2 major points. The first thing to say would be that the world has changed. The distribution of power has changed. Balance and stability is our objective, and the primacy of any one nation is insufficient to achieve balanced stability. Second, such a document should say that the two countries will work together with each other and others to build and adjust the current economic and security institutions to reflect these new realities. In short, we need to build what Dr. Kissinger called a Pacific community. Second, such a statement should embrace and reinforce interdependence. The United States and China should cooperate in the development of infrastructure projects around the world. The initial U.S. reaction to the AIIB was the wrong reaction. Washington, Beijing, and perhaps NGOs in both countries could cooperate on projects in Afghanistan, for instance. With respect to interdependence between our two countries, the right proposed direction is to encourage more investment in each other's employment-generating enterprises and to push for the earliest possible conclusion of a bilateral investment treaty, making it even clearer that China is welcome into the TPP, presuming that it moves forward. Beyond written declarations, China needs once again to reassure the outside world that it's committed to reform internally and externally, as Deng Xiaoping managed to do in the early 1990s with his great southern visit. To conclude, leaders in both the United States and China have responsibility to speak out against corrosive nationalism, reminding their people that the strategic justification for this bilateral relationship is simple and it's compelling. Neither the world nor our two countries can afford the United States and China as adversaries. Thank you.